Welcome, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our last Civility lecture for the 2015-2016 series. We will be beginning again in the fall, but taking a break for this summer. My name is Alice Knapp. I'm president of the Ferguson Library, and as I make this brief introduction, this is your cue to turn off your cell phone or turn it on to vibrate, but turn down the sound. We are delighted to be here with our partners, Hearst Media and the Dylan Schneider Group. We've been running this series since 2012, and here at the library, we call it our signature series on civility, and today more than ever, when you hear what's in the newspapers, you see how important it is to have a series that discusses civility. Right now, I'm going to introduce you to Joe Pisani, who is going to introduce our guest speaker tonight.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you to the library for the series. We haven't had a turnout like this in a long time. How many of you have the last name of Zezima? Okay. And if you're not a Zezima, I'm sure you're from the Advocate, right? A lot of loyal people here to welcome Jerry, a hometown boy, to come back and tell us a little bit about civility and humor. I've known Jerry a long time. When I was at the Advocate, he was in the features department. He was writing his column back then, and I've seen my life progress through his column. Fatherhood, baby boomerism, empty nest, grandfatherhood. You know, you feel old when you read it for so many years, but it's a great thing. Well, I'm sure you know, Jerry Zezima has a lifelong career of journalism, and I've worked, as I said before, many years with him here and at Newsday. And it began at his hometown paper, the Stamford Advocate. And for the last 2 decades, he's been at Newsday on Long Island, where he's an editor, and he continues to write his column, Zez Says, which appears in the Advocate, the Greenwich Time, and the Hearst newspapers. And very often, if you go online, you'll see it on the Huffington Post. He's won 7 Excellence in Journalism Awards for humorous writing from the Society of the Silurians, which is the oldest press club in the United States. He's also won 6 awards for humorous writing from the National Society of Newspaper Columnists, which is quite an achievement. He's author of 3 books, Leave It to Boomer, The Empty Nest Chronicles, and Grandfather Knows Best. And he says all of them are crimes against literature. Jerry's written for such magazines as Reader's Digest, Family Circle, and had recorded humorous commentaries for public radio programs such as Marketplace and All Things Considered. He's contributed funny reporting segments for WLI of Long Island and been interviewed on CBS News Sunday Morning. And he's an occasional speaker in comedy clubs around the New York area. Join me in welcoming Stamford native Jerry Zezima.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you all for coming. That was a very nice and mostly true introduction, so thank you. Joe and I go way back, and he's a great guy, and thank you for the introduction. Where did you get that? Oh, I thought it sounded familiar. Now, you may be wondering why Joe and Robert L. Dylan Schneider at the Dylan Schneider Group asked me. They are paragons of civility, and they asked me, a nationally syndicated newspaper columnist and author whose work has no redeeming social value, to take part in this distinguished series. And the answer is very simple. They were desperate. Well, maybe not, but I'm glad they invited me. Thank you to the Dylan Schneider Group. Thank you to Hearst Connecticut Media, which publishes, among many other papers, my hometown paper, the Stamford Advocate, where my humor column is run for the past 31 years. And thank you to the Ferguson Library. Thank you to all of these groups for lowering your otherwise high standards to have me. I really appreciate it. It's great to be back in Stamford, which, as you know, is my hometown. I was born and raised in Stamford. I can't say I grew up here, because obviously I have not grown up. but it's always great to be back. Now, I have to ask, it's a very nice turnout today. How many people here actually read my column in The Advocate? You knew I was going to be here and you showed up anyway? You are very, very brave people, possibly gluttons for punishment, but I appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming. Now, I'm going to talk about civility in humor and how you don't have to be cruel or mean-spirited or uncivil to get laughs or chuckles or smiles. You don't have to ridicule other people to do that. And that's the kind of stuff that I've been doing for a long time. Now, when people find out I'm a writer, they always ask when I decided to do what I want to do. They always ask, when did you decide to become a writer? And I decided that I wanted to be a writer in high school. It was at Stanford Catholic High School, now Trinity Catholic, up on Newfield Avenue. And my decision to become a writer can be encapsulated in one word: algebra. I could never do algebra. Now, how many people here remember algebra class? Okay, so you remember the typical algebra problem. The Smiths are leaving New York for Boston at 9 a.m., averaging 55 miles an hour. The Joneses are leaving Boston for New York at 10 a.m., averaging 50 miles an hour. Question: at what point in the 200-mile journey will they pass each other? Answer: who cares? Anyone who spends his time craning his neck to see when his friends will pass him on the other side of the road is a menace to society and should have his license revoked. I could never figure this out. I was always better in subjects where I really didn't have to know the answers, such as English composition. Now, I remember a particular class where we had to write an essay in high school. I don't remember exactly what the topic was, but we had to write an essay on the same topic and then get up in front of the class to read the essay. How many people remember having to do this? How many people wanted to do it? Nobody. Nobody wanted to do it except me. Everybody took it seriously except me. I wrote the silliest, stupidest, dumbest, funniest stuff I could think of. And I got up in front of the class, and I read my essay, and I got big laughs. And I thought, you know, I could do this. And my teachers were very supportive. They were too kind to say this explicitly, but they strongly implied that I was spectacularly unqualified to do anything else. So I was always the class clown, and my goal in life was to be silly and irresponsible and actually get paid for it. So I said, how can I do this? And I said, I know. I'll go into journalism, and I'll get a humor column. Well, fast forward a few years. I was a year out of college, had no job, no prospect, and I took myself by the hand one day, which must have looked pretty silly, and I walked into the office of my hometown paper, the Stanford Advocate, and just announced that I wanted a job. So the editor, Roland Blay, asked what experience I had. I had none. I didn't write for the high school paper. I didn't write for the college paper. So instead of throwing me out, he gave me a test. And fortunately, it was not an algebra test. It was a general knowledge test. It was current events, it was grammar, it was history. And obviously I did well enough because I got a job. But there were questions to which I did not know the answers. So instead of leaving them blank or taking half-hearted guesses, I remembered what I did on that essay in high school and I wrote the silliest, stupidest, dumbest, funniest stuff I could think of. And later on, Mr. Blaze said, "That's what got you the job." It showed signs of creativity. And I was going to say to him, "I didn't think you were supposed to make stuff up in a newspaper." For once in my life, I kept my mouth shut, and I got a job. And I was successively a copy boy, I was a sports writer, I was a feature writer, I was the features editor, I was the Metro editor. I had failed miserably in one job after another until there was really nothing left to do but write a humor column. And the Advocate, God bless them, gave me a humor column. So I thought, well, what am I going to write about? And I decided to write about the funny little things of everyday life. Because a lot of people say, if you're a writer, where do you come up with your ideas? And if you write about everyday life, stuff happens every day. So I decided to do that. And I have had a gold mine of material. Because in my life, I have been surrounded by women. My wife, Sue, perhaps not coincidentally, is a woman. Our two daughters, Katie and Lauren, are young women. Lizzie, our late beloved dog, was a female. Ramona, the oldest of our 4 cats, was a female. Kitty, the next cat in line, was a female. Bernice, one of Kitty's 2 kitties, is a female. The only other male in the house besides me was Kitty's other kitty, Henry, and he was a mama's boy, didn't even count, and he's since gone to that big litter box in the sky. So I'm the only male in the house. And one of the nicest compliments I ever got about my columns was from a woman who said, I think they're very funny, but what I really like is you don't put down your wife, and you don't use your kids for cheap laughs. Now, obviously, I'm not above trying to get cheap laughs, but the vast majority of the time, they're at my expense. And that's how I try to be civil about writing and about humor, not to denigrate anyone else. I poke fun at myself, and you can still get laughs or chuckles or smiles without being cruel or mean-spirited or uncivil. Another thing I always get from people is, it seems like you're living in our house. And my stock answer now is, actually I am, and you're out of beer, so please go buy some more. But I'll give you a couple of examples of how I try to use civility in the kind of things I write about. When my daughters were in high school, one day, Lauren, the younger daughter, came downstairs and announced she was going to school. And I looked at her, and she had on a shirt, I think a sweatshirt, an outer jacket, because it was cold out, hiking boots, no mountains where we live, but she was wearing hiking boots, and a pair of plaid flannel pajama bottoms. So I said to her, Lauren, aren't you going to get ready for school? And she said, I am ready. I said, you're not dressed. She said, yes, I am. I said, you're wearing pajamas. Well, you parents and grandparents know this look. She rolled her eyes and said, Dad, this is what the kids wear. So she kissed me on my obviously empty head and went to school. A little while later, my older daughter, Katie, came down dressed the same way. She went to school. I said to my wife, Sue, what the heck is going on? And she said, where have you been? This is what the kids wear. Now, my kids have always thought that I am the most uncool man in America. And they may be right, except they have a lot of gall to say that because they buy me my clothes. So anyway, I decided for one day, and one day only, to prove them wrong. So I wore pajamas to work. So my daughters went to school, and I came downstairs, and I had on a shirt. I had on an outer jacket because it was cold. I was wearing a pair of shoes, and I had a pair of plaid flannel pajama bottoms. And because I'm a professional, I wore a tie. I hate ties. I wore one tonight because I know it's a distinguished event, but I don't like them. But I wore them then. I wore one then. So Sue said, I'm glad I'm not going to be seen with you today. But that did not stop her from sending me out on some errands. The first stop was the bank. Guess what I found? A line. 6, 8, 10 people. Nobody wanted to make eye contact with me. But I could tell what they were thinking. My God, he's got a gun. Well, if you've ever worn pajamas in public, which I trust you have not, you probably know that most of them don't have pockets, so I was not packing heat. So I got up to the teller window, and Lisa, the teller, whom I knew, this was in Norotan Heights, she looked at me and she said, you going to work like that? And I said, yeah. And she said, and I quote, why don't you withdraw some money, go to the store, and buy yourself a pair of pants? And I said, I'd like to, but I don't have time. I have to go to the post office. Sue sent me to the post office to buy a book of stamps. I went to the post office, same thing. Line of people, no one wanted to acknowledge me. I could tell what they were thinking. For once, a customer is going to go postal. So I got up to the window, and Hubert, the postal worker, looked at me and he said, you know, I'm going to have a pajama party. You're the first guy I'm going to invite. And I said, thanks. He never did. So I got the stamps and I went to work at the Advocate. And at the time, the Advocate was at 75 Tresser Boulevard, across from the Government Center. And I walked in, and Al, the security guard, looked at me and said, is that the new style? And I said, yeah. He said, I wouldn't wear it. But he let me go upstairs. Here's a man who shows up to a place of employment wearing pajamas. Oh, go ahead, go upstairs. Well, I went upstairs, and I was the hit of the newsroom. One woman thought I was wearing golf pants. I don't play golf. Another woman, who was the fashion editor, told me I was very stylish. She is no longer the fashion editor. And a third woman actually winked at me and said, you look cute. And I said, alrighty. So I sat down, didn't get up until my shift was over. At the end of the day, I got up, I drove home, and there were my daughters giddy with excitement. Katie called me a virtual fashion slave, which was the term at the time, I guess, and Lauren, the younger one, who precipitated this whole thing, beamed at me and said, Dad, you're so cool. It was the ultimate compliment. I have yet to hear it again. But I wrote about it. I wrote a column about this, and I did not denigrate my daughters. I didn't poke fun at them. I wrote it just as it happened. And I think I wanted to be civil about it. And I think the little lesson in all of it is this. If this is the worst kind of stuff your kids do, you're pretty darn lucky. And a lot of people don't get it. They don't understand. You know, how many times has something happened and you say, oh gosh, remember that time? Oh, that was so funny. 10 years ago, a year ago, 3 months ago, whatever. At the time, you didn't think so. The trick is to see the humor in things when they happen. And I think a lot of civility is lost in people who don't do that. They get all ticked off about little things, and then it starts. And there's an argument, and there is uncivil behavior, whether it's in the house, whether it's in the office, wherever it is, people just don't see it. Let me give you one more quick example. Lauren, my younger daughter, when she was in college, we fast forward a few years. How many people here are parents and or grandparents? Okay. She came home from college one summer, and her room was immaculate until about 20 minutes after she got home. And then it was, and I want people to throw out some adjectives. Describe the typical child's room, please. Somebody. Hurricane hit it, right. Disaster, right. Pigsty. There were clothes on the floor, there was food, there was all, the remains of Jimmy Hoffa could have been in there, and you never would have known it. So Sue, my wife, said to me, Lauren's room is a disaster area. So because I think differently than most people, fortunately for most people, I decided to see if I could have her room officially declared a disaster area, so we would be eligible for state or federal funds to clean it up. So I researched the process, and I found out you have to start at the state level. By this time, we had moved to Long Island, so I called Albany, and I was put on with a man named Dennis Michalski, who was the head of the State Disaster Preparedness Department. And I told him why I was calling, and I'm always very honest about what I'm up to. And he said, it's a funny thing you should call. We just brought my son home from college. I said, how's his room? He said, it's a disaster area. I said, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you could send over trucks, heavy equipment, we can get this stuff cleaned out. And I described it to him, and he said to me, it sounds like too big a job even for the state. He said, you're going to have to go federal. So I called the White House. And at the time, George W. Bush was in office. And he and Mrs. Bush have two daughters, Jenna and Barbara, about the same ages as Katie and Lauren. So I wanted to know if the president had ever declared his daughter's rooms disaster areas. And I got up to Noelia Rodriguez, who was Mrs. Bush's press secretary. And I posed the question. I explained why I called. I posed the question. And I said, has the president ever declared Janet and Barbara's rooms disaster areas? And she said, and I quote, that would be classified information. So I said, well, could you help me out? And she said, I think we can, but definitely not before the end of the summer. Why don't you just close the door? And we did. And I wrote about it. And again, I did not ridicule my daughter. I wrote it just as it happened. I just take things one step further than any normal person would take them, because, of course, I'm not normal. But it would be easy to go on some rant about how messy your daughter's room is, or how terrible your son does this or that or the other thing. There's no need for that. There is not. So this is how I think and how I write. Now, since then, of course, I've gone through many, many other facets of my life. I was father of the bride, and that was great. My sons-in-law are just fabulous guys. And now, you probably know, I'm a grandfather. And Chloe, my granddaughter, oh my God, she's just the sweetest thing. She could be in her mother's arms. I walk in the room, Poppy, Poppy, she wants to come to me. It is just the best. So I've written about that. And I've chronicled it all in 3 books. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have an edge to your humor or your comedy, and we're going to get into in comedy shortly. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my humor heroes. My humor heroes are the 3 Bs: Benchley, Buchwald, and Bombeck. Now, how many people here remember Irma Bombeck? She was great. Irma Bombeck was a genius. Now, a lot of people think she wrote only for women, or, as the derisive term goes, housewives. No. She wrote for anyone who has or has ever been in a family, which means she wrote for everybody, women and men. And she once said, it took her about a week to realize that there were only 2 people she could poke fun at without offending her readers: herself and Hitler. And she said, I'd rather not write about Hitler. So she wrote about herself. Art Buchwald was great. He was the reason I got into journalism. His column was running in the Stanford Advocate. I read his column, and I said, man, there's a guy who gets paid to write funny stuff. It's like doing stand-up comedy, except you don't have to show up. You just write your column, and, a lot of people see it. In my case, not many admit it, although you do, so thank you. And he was great. And it took me a long time to work up the nerve to write him a letter. And I did. And he wrote back. And he was as nice and as funny as you would expect him to be. And we had a correspondence for the last few years of his life. And the third guy is Robert Benchley, who I think was the funniest writer who ever lived. And a lot of people say, oh, didn't he write Jaws? No, that was his grandson, Peter Benchley. Robert Benchley was fall-down funny. And the common thread was that they didn't write cruel or mean-spirited humor. They were civil. And they still got laughs. And they became famous. Now, contrast that with a lot of other humorists or comedians who don't do that. Some of them are very successful as well, and some of them are very good. But I just really don't have it in me to do that. Now, I don't write about politics. I did a little early on, every once in a while, but now that this is the political season, I'm sure you've noticed that there is not a lot of civility in the discourse. It sort of makes you yearn for Art Buchwald or Will Rogers, who would have known how to handle this. Even the comedians and the commentators and the print humorists seem to be sinking down to the level of the politicians. And it makes for uncivil discourse. Sure, you want to laugh. And again, it doesn't mean that if something is, say, vicious or hard-edged, that it can't be funny. Mark Twain used to rip into people all the time, and he was hilarious. S.J. Perelman, people like that. But the point is, you don't have to be. And I also must say that a lot of the civility that I've come to respect actually was instilled in me and my sisters, Elizabeth and Susan is here, by our parents. My mom is here, and my late father, the original and the best Jerry Zezima. So it comes from not just not wanting to hurt other people, but realizing that, as William Zinsser once said about Art Buchwald, he could say with humor what none of the solemn pundits could get away with. And people actually listen to you when you use that device. Now, Joe had informed me that I should open it up to questions. Are we about right on schedule, or? Okay. And I am going to get into comedy as well, comedians, late night comedians, comedy teams, because that's part of this as well. And part of the discourse these days is with the stand-up comics and with late night talk show hosts. But so I'll open it up to that. But before I do, I really want to say a big thank you to the Stamford Advocate, one of the very few papers that actually is open to humor. Not many papers are. The Advocate is. I mean, I have my humor column, and there are other writers at the Advocate who do this. Not full-time as I do, but occasionally. John Brunig, I don't know if he's here today, he's my editor. He's a fabulous writer. Kevin McKeever, Jerry Dumas, Mort Walker, two famous cartoonists, Jim Shea, and there are other great voices there too, not humorous, Angela Corella and Jack Kavanaugh. But the Advocate is open to that, and you don't see it that often in newspapers. For the reason, I believe, is that a lot of editors are afraid that somebody, somewhere, just might be offended by something, so they just play it utterly safe. And it's blanding down newspapers. So kudos to the Advocate for that. I'm going to open it up to questions, but I do want to touch on other aspects of civility and humor and comedy. So probably the biggest question on your mind is, why the hell did they invite him to speak today? But it's too late to do anything about it now. Anybody have a question about civility, humor? Yes?
Okay. Thanks. Big fan for years.
Oh, well, thank you.
Actually, I just burst out laughing sometimes reading your column, and thanks to the Advocate for keeping it. Just if you've ever had a time when you had a kind of a block and you had facing a deadline, what you did creatively to kind of get to the funny.
Well, I'm a blockhead, so it happens more often than you think. Well, as I said earlier, I really don't, because if you write about everyday life, stuff happens every day. It's not to say that you can always make something out of it, but I've often wondered about writer's block. Why isn't there the same thing in other professions? Like surgeon's block. What do I do now? Accountant's block. That would be like H&R block, I guess. But, so how do I find the funny in that? In this way, by trying to see the humor in almost everything. Red Smith, anybody remember Red Smith, the great sports writer? He once defined a humorist as a person whose mind functions differently than most and who has eyes that see past the horizon to discover wondrous things. It's trying to see, and it's not easy, but it is easy to pick stuff out and say, a little grain can become a column. And it's the best and the funniest stuff is the true stuff. It's the stuff that happens to you. Because if it happens to you, it happens to almost everybody else. And I've always thought that there are two ways to make people laugh. One is something that takes you by surprise. It's like the punchline of a joke, comes out of left field, and you're surprised and you laugh. And the other is the exact opposite. It's the familiar. You see yourself in it, and you laugh at the recognition of it. So, in my case, I really don't have to make anything up. Now, I know I'm going to ask Alice's forgiveness before I say this. This is going to sound like literary sacrilege. But sometimes I think fiction writers must lead pretty dull lives if they have to make their stuff up. Then, of course, I realized that the best fiction writers, the best fiction is rooted in reality. And the best fiction writers take us places that we couldn't take ourselves. So that's why I admire them so much and why I can't do that. But finding the funny isn't that difficult. You don't have to be a professional humorist or a stand-up comic to be able to do that. And I really do think that if you have a good sense of humor, it improves your life. And also, it puts you in a good mood. And if you're in a good mood, you might do something nice for someone else. You know, like let them into traffic or something. I know it doesn't happen too often around here. It doesn't happen too often on Long Island either. But it might put that person in a good mood. It's a cumulative thing. It's small, but it's not insignificant. So anyway, that's a long way of saying, I don't know. No, I'm saying you don't really have to, have a block. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Saturday Night Live monologues. Saturday Night Live monologues.
Yes.
Civil, uncivil, and why?
Well, it depends on which ones. First of all, you have to realize that I am of the age now where I'm Saturday night asleep. It depends on who does them and at what era they were. Some of them are civil. So honestly, I haven't watched the show that much recently, so I don't know. But humor is the most subjective thing in the world. What's funny to one person is not to another. And so someone might listen to Saturday Night Live monologue and say, that was brilliant. And somebody else might say, what? It was stupid, or it was crass, or whatever. It depends on your perspective. Generally, I like the show, but like anything, it doesn't always work. So, yes. Yes, you.
Thank you. Getting to George Carlin's 7 Dirty Words.
Yeah. You want me to say them?
No, you don't have to say them, but
This is a very distinguished series. It wouldn't be too civil to say those.
I was wondering if those words weren't banned, what you think the state of late-night comedy would be in general, and how do you feel about the use of profane language in bringing about humor?
Well, not a heck of a lot. It's used all the time. I guess originally it was used for shock value. And, let me say, it doesn't mean that, what the kind of stuff I do, and it's got to be in a family newspaper, so I can't, use language like that, that it's the only way to get laughs. George Carlin was brilliant. But I think, people like George Carlin or Richard Pryor, people like that, who were just gut-bustingly funny, used it as shock value and to make a point. They actually were great writers. They wrote their stuff out. Every word mattered. Now, it seems, it's so easily used, and it's not shocking anymore. Sometimes it's just boring. Yet another blue word. Be a little more creative. Now, I'm a geezer. You know this. It doesn't mean that, well, the humorists and comedians of my generation are the only ones that were any good, and the younger ones aren't. Of course not. There's some great ones among the younger generation. But as far as the blue language is concerned, my personal opinion, it's just overused. And it doesn't have the same effect as it once did. Yes? Anyone else? Yes? No. If that's for me, I'm busy. It's probably my parole officer.
How do you handle your own reactions to some of the things you read that are the opposite of what it is that your writings? How do you deal with when you think what a hypocrite that person is, or how that person handles an audience, and how you respond viscerally to what it is that you see and that you therefore do not do or apply to your own writing?
Well, there are plenty of people who don't do what I do, and I think they're very smart. If viscerally I respond or I react to something I see or read or hear that I don't like or agree with, I try not to lose any sleep over it. If it puts me to sleep, then there's no problem. I try to take a civil approach. If I disagree with someone or something that someone has written, my reaction is, well, okay, that's the way that person thinks. I may not agree with it, but again, I try to have a civil reaction to it. And sometimes it's just best to ignore it. Save yourself a lot of grief. Maybe the president of Tums wouldn't agree, but you don't get yourself all worked up. And the person may have a valid point, or whatever he or she is saying or writing. But the instinctive reaction these days, and especially in the political season, is to fire back. And everything is a conflict. And therefore, it's not very civil. Now, we can't all have high tea every day at 4 o'clock and, and all be the pinkies up. And no. But there's a way to react, I believe, to things. And it doesn't mean that you can't ever get angry over something. It's a human reaction. There are things that are just going to tick you off. But it's how you react. With me, if there's something that ticks me off, most of the time I don't even write about it because I don't want to get all worked up. Or I try to find a civil way to handle it and then do it my own way. So I don't let a lot of those things bother me. Yes, sir.
There's I guess, a certain branch of humor that's derived from political incorrectness. Mm-hmm. What's your take on that type of humor that may take advantage of racial groups or other stereotypes?
I don't look too fondly on either side, frankly. I don't think that it is good or creative or witty or smart to denigrate other groups just for the sake of pick a group, whatever group, and to be politically incorrect. On the other side of it, there is the thought police, the PC thugs, who, if you disagree with them or they disagree with you, want to have you branded, ostracized, whatever. They're just as bad. And this country was founded on free speech. You may not always agree with everyone, but you have the right to say it. And I think that it is consummately ironic that some of the people on the PC side were the free speech folks who now that they're holding sway say, oh yes, you can say anything you want as long as it conforms to what we say. So it's like the McCarthyism of the left. It was bad enough when it was on the right. Both sides, I think, need to rethink things and be a little more civil about it. Yes, Joe?
It really gets to be boring when you have to read an article or even watch television and you have like a letter, ... the first letter of the word and the second last letter of the word, and you know it's a swear word, it's a dirty word and all that, and to read that, you're like, read that, oh, wait, skip that, I have another ...
Right.
It's really frustrating, and I know that Stanford Advocate does not do that. It's enjoyable reading, but even the television, they hear beep, 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 beep.
Right.
My grandson came up with an idea. Why are you even watching that if if they're beep, beep, beeping every word?
It's a very good
and
point.
that's very frustrating.
Yeah.
I can't take that anymore.
Well, I'll tell you, it must be, the ... thing must be very, very frustrating to women named Dorothy. ... It's lazy. It's lazy, in my opinion. Come up with a more creative way, a funnier way. If you're trying to make a serious point, be a better writer. There you go. And you know, the beeps, I don't know. That's, yeah, it's annoying, but turn it off. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
So on New Year's Eve, I was at a comedy club.
Uh-huh.
And one of the acts, his entire act revolved around not being able to find a girlfriend and basically putting roofies in drinks and date raping women. And
This was at a comedy club?
it was at a comedy club on New Year's Eve. So he was just one of the acts. Luckily, the other acts were, I found, much more amusing.
Right.
But, you know, as a woman and having a college-age daughter, I didn't find that really that amusing. And I happened to tweet that I did not find it amusing and was abused on the internet, like, you know, well, bitch, if you didn't, you know, what, you were in a comedy club, if you didn't think it was funny, you shouldn't have gone out to a comedy club, you know.
Right.
And so I totally take your point about free speech, but do you feel like there are, you know, does what is, you know, do you feel that any, you know, I have a male friend who thinks anything is up for comedy, like there are no limits. And personally, I feel that, you know, maybe what was funny 50 years ago, maybe things have moved on, and maybe there's a reason why we don't joke about those things now.
Right. But I would say that, now again, humor is very subjective. What's funny to one person isn't to another. So he has a right to say that. You have a right not to laugh and not to go back. And if enough people are like you, then pretty soon he'll be in another profession. Yes, sir.
I remember one of your funniest columns, I think, was from about 30 years ago.
Yeah, I've been going downhill ever since.
One of your most
It's been
recent...
a long slide, hasn't it?
One of the most recent funny... we had a real estate baron who lived in Greenwich and was naming a lot of things for himself. And you pronounced in a column that you had from this time forward, you were going to be known as the Trump Zezima.
Yes.
And then...
I remember that.
There was a divorce that happened subsequent to that.
Yes.
And then there was a fight between Donald and Ivana as to who would get the Trump Zezima.
Right.
And she said the divorce agreement said, you get the Trump Zezima. And he said, no, I get the lamp, you get the Trump Zezima. And,
Right. I remember this.
So it's a two-part question. First part is, are you heading to Washington? Is that part of your plan? And the second part is, does our country need a humorist laureate, as we have a poet laureate? In other words, in the interest of civility, do we need to have somebody who unites our country with humor?
Well, if the job's open, I mean, sure. Am I heading to Washington? Actually, yes, but not for the reason you think. My older daughter, Katie, lives in Washington, so I would go see her and her husband, Dave, before I went to see anybody else there. Now, political humor. You may also remember, and if you don't, you're about to have a haunting flashback. I said I don't write about politics, but early on I sort of did. Well, I had a campaign for vice president. I started at 1992. It went to 92, 96, and 2000. I kind of cut it off there, but for vice president of the United States. And I wanted to be vice president because really the vice president doesn't do a hell of a lot. And that is my specialty. So I was looking for candidates to run for president to be my running mate. And 1992, the first President Bush was running. He had already picked Dan Quayle. Bill Clinton was running. So I wrote to him. He wrote back 3 times. Thank you for your support. I said, I'm not supporting you unless you pick me as your running mate. And the third candidate was, Ross Perot. And he didn't answer back because I figured he was too short to reach the mailbox. So I finally found this guy, Alan Abel. You ever hear him? Alan Abel's a funny guy. He's a media prankster. So he and I teamed up. And he ran under the name of Porky. My nickname is Zez. So we were the Gershwin-inspired ticket of Porky and Zez. And we ran under the banner of the cocktail party. And we actually had a campaign. Now, this is how I tried to use civility and political humor without ripping into the candidates or sinking to their level. 1996, we were much more organized. And there was Debate 96 in Hartford. And Alan and I actually were the opening act for Debate 96 in Hartford. We had a convention at a hotel in Stamford. And according to Lois Pontbriand, remember her, the city and town clerk? We actually got votes. We need to find these people. But we had this goofball campaign going. Healthcare. We decided, we came up with, God bless you, well, very healthcare, and then he sneezes. It's a very important issue even now, as you can see. It is something to sneeze at. So, Big Apple coverage. We came up with it in a cab in New York City. 10-cent copay on every apple. Apple a day keeps the doctor away. There you go. We were going to put truth serum in the Senate drinking fountain. Gun control. Anyone in America can have a gun. Anyone. But it would operate at 1% capacity. So you'd shoot a bullet, it would go 3 inches and fall straight to the ground. There you go. Everyone's happy. But this is the kind of stuff that we did. I didn't write columns ripping into the candidates, and it was fun. We went up to the New Hampshire primary, and we had in Bartlett, New Hampshire, up in the White Mountains, our campaign headquarters was the Roadkill Cafe, and it was great. It was a lot of fun. I stopped doing it because it's like, been there, done that kind of thing. And, I mean, really, how are we going to top the people who are running this time around? But, I mean, it's an example, I think, of using civility or a more gentle approach to contrast with the vituperation that you see and you read and you hear about. So that's what we did. Anyone else? One more question. I should have said it to the last person. Oh yes, there is one more question.
Do you think there are any stand-up comedians that have a civil approach as you do in writing humor? I mean, are there any?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to know who they are.
Jerry Seinfeld, and let me tell you something. I am going to sue him for half his money for stealing my first name. I am approximately a month and a half older than he is. I was here first. Unfortunately, my lawyer is in prison, so I can't sue him yet. But him, because it's the show about nothing. He homes in on these little things that really aren't hurtful. Ray Romano, my wife would always say to me, hey, that should be us. Hun, half the people in America say that should be us. But now that I have 3 books, I'm thinking, that should be us. It's family humor. And he started as a stand-up. Seinfeld, Bob Newhart, going way back, I thought he was great. Jack Benny. I mean, now you're really going back. But you talk about stand-ups. A man who is not nearly as popular as he once was, nonetheless, was terrific at stand-up as Bill Cosby. The really bad thing about that situation is first, foremost, and really exclusively the women who allegedly have been, abused. But he had this persona, and people bought into it. And the persona itself was terrific, and I thought he was great as a stand-up. Doesn't mean, again, that you can't have a stand-up comic who uses curse words or blue language for effect. If he or she uses them to great effect, then fine. But those are the ones I would mention. Quickly, I know we have to end this. The comedy teams, I love them. The Three Stooges. Worship the Three Stooges. Certainly. Well, not to each other. Like when you're wielding mallets and saws and poking people in the eyes or hitting other people with pies, probably not. No, they were really funny. Very quick story. My father, I heard him, I thought he was crying one night. I said, my God, what's going on? I patted down the hall, and there was my father crying with laughter, watching Laurel and Hardy. They were great. The Marx Brothers, Abbott and Costello, their routines are still hold up. So, I mean, the teams were great. Pardon? Jerry Lewis, another guy I'm going to sue, although he's older than I am. Burns and Allen, yes. Allen, how are you? Yes, Burns and Allen. Again, you might expect somebody of my decrepitude to talk about the older comics or the older humorists. Again, there are some greatly talented young people who deserve a break and who are very, very good. So it's not just, they were better in my day. No, Not at all. And it's the same way with anything. Young people get a really bad rap these days. No, they don't know anything, they're not interested in anything, they have short attention spans, they're always texting. Let me tell you something, they communicate a lot better than I did when I was that age. Of course, in those days, Alexander Graham Bell was still alive, and we had just invented the telephone. But it's a generational thing. But here's something else, trying to see the humor in things. Also try to give everyone a fair shake, including people who aren't like you. A different generation, different gender, different whatever. They have things to say too. And sometimes it's pretty good and it's pretty wise. Anyone else? Joe is approaching me, not with a blunt instrument. Good. Wait a minute. Okay. Okay. I think that's it. I have two things to say. One is be civil. Remember this. The Dylan Schneider Group and Hearst, Connecticut Media and the Ferguson Library is not putting this on as a lark. It's true, and it's important. And another thing, I'm going to charge you all with something, not charge you as far as money is concerned. I work for free, and I'm worth every penny. But I want you to do something, and it is this. Fill the world with love and laughter and make it a better place. Thank you.
That was outstanding, and it was a great way to end the season. We will see you all in September, and thank you for being loyal to the series. Thank you, Jerry.